Daryl Morey and the rest of the Sixers front office continue their journey to improving the Sixers roster and putting them on par with the true championship contenders in this league. We got the latest update of their decision to sign Reggie Jackson from this Woj bomb, a bit of a surprise move for the Sixers team that is already fairly deep at the guard position, but we are at the point of the offseason in which value speaks, and getting him on at a veteran's minimum at this point in the game is a huge addition. And it also is worth noting that he does have a relationship with Paul George during their time together with the Los Angeles Clippers there, so that's certainly plays into what he can bring to this team. And particularly when speaking about what he brings from an on-court standpoint, let's take a look at what he brings from a statistical standpoint there. And for Reggie Jackson, we're talking about last year with the Denver Nuggets, 10.2 points per game, 3.8 assists, 1.9 rebounds, 0.5 steals per game, shot 35.9% from beyond the three-point line, but 39.7% from the corner. He is 34 years old, just 6'2", but he does have a 7-foot wingspan there. And one thing that is especially worth noting with Reggie Jackson is I do think he's a replacement to this campaign type role. That yes, the Sixers are deep at the guard position, and I'm going to touch deeper on that in a second, but what you can think of with campaign is a guy that can come in and change the pace of a game. The way he can just knock down a couple threes, that with Reggie, unlike the Kyle Lowrys of the world or the Jeff Doughtons of the world, that Reggie Jackson is a guy that can spin a game on its head. Now, he spent last season with the Denver Nuggets and ultimately did not find the role that was truly right for him, that he kind of fell into that six-man type role for him. They ultimately went another direction by bringing in Russell Westbrook, which is an interesting decision there. I know I mentioned that there's already this relationship between Paul George and Reggie Jackson, and I do think that is a large reason why that he is going to be in this organization at all and playing a role on this team, because I do think there is a familiarity there, that I don't think things clicked with Reggie and the Denver Nuggets the way that things were hoped, but I still think that says a lot more about the system that was played there, that Reggie to me strikes me as much more of a guy that can, handle, create for himself, that he wasn't really a guy that could play off Nikola Jokic, and things certainly fell off a cliff when Jokic stepped on the floor in Denver, but I think that says much more about the impact that he has in their offense than anything that it does about Reggie specifically there. And once again, to dive into specifically what he did bring to the table last year, I did want to touch on some of his minutes per game and everything with the Denver Nuggets here. So to touch on that exactly, we're talking about him filling in for 22.2 minutes per game. The stats don't jump off the page, but once again, he is that type of spark player. That is the appeal to Reggie Jackson. And to kind of compare to the depth chart and the other options that the Sixers team does have at the guard position, we're talking about Tyrese Maxey, we're talking about Kyle Lowry, we're talking about Reggie Jackson and Jeff Dougghton Jr. as the primary point guards. Eric Gordon is also a guy that can certainly create on ball, and I do think we'll get the opportunity to do that. And Jared McCain is a really interesting story there. That to me is one of my bigger takeaways with this. And to get into specifically what I mean here, I do want to dive a little deeper into this. So to speak on Jared McCain and what he brings to this Sixers team, I do think this is something that I'm a little concerned for the Jared McCain future. That I am a believer in his talent, and I do think he is worth developing. He's a player that I think is that perfect mix of has that long-term potential, but is capable of helping this team right now. I know the shot did not fall at the rate that was expected in Summer League, but honestly, I was really happy with the process of what he brought to the table there. That when you look at the processing, the way he went about the game, the decisions that he made, it was just about everything I could hope for from a player who carried himself with a much more mature mentality than I expected. And I am concerned that when looking at this depth chart and how many guards there are now he's going to have to compete with, it does feel like he's going to get buried a little bit. And he's not the type of guy that I think you should throw in the G League and have develop down there. That I think he's ready to make a win-now contributions to a contending team. This isn't a situation like a Ricky Council, for example, who I think was at his best playing through his mistakes, learning to get better. A guy like Jaden Springer, I felt that way about as well, that it was important for him to play as much basketball as possible. Jared McCain is a guy who gets it, that he's capable of bringing something to the Sixers team right now, and I do have my concerns that a player like Reggie Jackson might take away from that opportunity. Now, with that all being said, the goal is clearly to contend for a championship this year, and that is why you have the players like Reggie Jackson, that he is a guy with a proven playoff pedigree who has played in some big games, stepped up in some big moments, and that's also a reason why you brought in a guy like Kyle Lowry there. So to touch on that a little more, I did want to take a little bit of a look at what Kyle Lowry brings to the table. Once again, when looking at the depth chart for this Sixers team, that it's essentially going to be Tyrese Maxey as that primary role, then it is going to be Kyle Lowry and Reggie Jackson as some combination of that backup. They have very different skill sets for what they bring to the table. If you want to get a bucket, if you need an offensive spark, Reggie Jackson is certainly your guy for that. Once again, to dive into what he brings to the table from a statistical standpoint, it is that 10.2 points per game, and there is that self-creation. Another thing that I did want to note is he did post a career high last year in his assist-to-turnover ratio, which is intriguing there. That has been something that has plagued him a little bit throughout his career. And to touch on some of the stats that are also bringing to the table, did want to take a look at Kyle Lowry here, that he shot the ball really well last year. And yes, he's 38 years old. Yes, we know that he is not what he once was, but he's still a guy that provided 8.1 points per game, 3.2 rebounds, 4.2 assists, a 1 steal a game, which is pretty impressive in the limited minutes there. Shot 39.2% from beyond the three-point arc and 45.2% from beyond three there. So really intriguing numbers there. And he is a guy that I think can fill that role of when you need a defensive stop or just to play a little bit of spot minutes for this Sixers team. Lowry's going to be ready for that. That he's another guy who has a championship ring on his finger, brings that pedigree, and was a guy that Tyrese Maxey spoke really highly about continuing to be involved in the organization at his recent press conference. We will have a video coming out later on some of the takeaways from Tyrese Maxey's presser. Paul George also being introduced later, so stay tuned for that video as well. He has not stepped down to do that interview at the point of me recording this, but I will have some content coming out on each of these. But I did think it was telling that Tyrese Maxey was really happy that Kyle Lowry was sticking around, and that was a guy that he pointed out specifically. And as I mentioned with Tyrese Maxey, that truly is what this is all about, is we know that this guy is the face of the guard position for the Sixers team. We're talking about 25.9 points per game last year, 6.2 assists, which is a massive leap forward there, 3.7 rebounds per game, shot 45% from the field, 37.3% from beyond the three-point arc there, also 61% from the corner, which is absurd stuff there. That is something that I still think he's going to continue getting better, that he cracked the All-Star team for the first time last year, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon. And even with the addition of a guy like Paul George, to me, it's very clear that this is still Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey's team. That Paul George is a massive improvement over a guy like Tobias Harris, but this is still about the Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid show. And frankly, from what each of those guys are saying publicly, Tyrese reinforced this again at the press conference today. It's clear the relationship between them is stronger than ever. That Maxey once again spoke about how this was something that Joel was one of the first guys to believe in him. Joel has called him the best teammate that he's had. It is good vibes between those two, and I do only think that is going to continue there. But ultimately, the good vibes only continue if winning is involved, and that is what this is about. So for Reggie Jackson here, this is something where I do think he's going to play a role on this Sixers team. This is the depth chart that is beginning to shape into the real deal contender. Now, there are 2 NBA roster spots remaining. They did give Jeff Doughton that 2-way contract, which honestly leads to a little bit even more of my surprise with Reggie Jackson here. But I think this is something where Daryl Morey truly is looking at the absolute value. That while it may not be the perfect fit from a positional standpoint, that he's a far better player than I think the just minimum contract would indicate there. And Morey cannot help himself when that is the case. And there will be nights where this pays off, where Reggie Jackson will, I wouldn't say win games for the Sixers team, but provide a spark that certainly leads them in the right direction there. So I'm intrigued by what that can be. Now, as I mentioned, there are 2 roster spots remaining. At least one will be filled by the Sixers team here. And I do think that that is worth noting, that there is still some need at that power forward position. As things currently stand, Caleb Martin and KJ Martin listed as the 2 power forwards on roster. And to be perfectly frank, neither one of them are truly the ideal power forwards there. Now, there is a guy that I do think is pretty much a shoo-in to ultimately nail down one of those final spots. And for specifically who I'm referring to there, it is Marcus Morris. That he did spend some time with the Sixers last year, also was traded midseason in that Buddy Hield trade. He was traded, came to Philadelphia in that James Harden trade, then shipped off again midseason. He overall averaged 6.4 points per game, 2.7 rebounds, shot 40.3% from 3. He is that true kind of stretch forward position there. 93.8% of his threes assisted and 45.1% of his shots coming from beyond the arc. We do know that he is that Philadelphia resident, a guy that was given the key to the city last year, wears things quite proudly, that he is a Philadelphia native, very involved in the community. You see him at the events like the Rumpf Classic and a ton of other that occur down here. So shout out to Mook. I do think he would be interested in staying home. And by the way, I think that's a significant reason why Kyle Lowry is still sticking around. And if we really want to get optimistic, we do know that there's other guys that are built in to help out. That one of the additions that did occur that shouldn't go for granted is Andre Drummond here. And what he brings to the table from a statistical standpoint, we're talking about 8.4 points per game, 9.0 rebounds. The block shots could be a little bit better there, but he is a guy that's going to be the best backup center that we've seen from Joel Embiid for quite some time. So very excited he's back, and I'm curious if Nick Nurse gets a little creative to try and share the floor with them. It was clear there was not that level of trust with a guy like Paul Reed last year, but we do see a lot more veteran presence in Andre Drummond and a guy who knows his role a little bit more than we did see with Paul. And for what it's worth, while I was hopeful from a skill set perspective that it could have made it work, this is 2 consecutive coaches that just haven't had that level of trust in Paul Reed. And for what it's worth, he's much more of an instinctive player than a guy like Andre Drummond, who just kind of knows how to play basketball. There was always a little bit something in Paul Reed that wanted to do a little too much or was caught out of position at times. That's something that drives coaches crazy, and that's something I don't expect to see from either a guy like Adem Bona, who I think also will get a fair shake and opportunity this year, and Andre Drummond as well, who we know exactly who he is at this point in his career. So still some work to polish out this complete Sixers roster here. As I mentioned, 2 NBA roster slots remaining, and they will be filling at least one of them. I do think there's a chance they enter the season with just 14 guys on roster. They did that for a lot of last year's season and ultimately upgraded Jeff Doughton's 2-way contract to a standard NBA deal. I would be surprised if that's the direction at this point. That was what I initially expected the game plan to be, but this addition of Reggie Jackson, I do think changes things a little bit from that perspective. So I think they're going to be looking at whatever power forward or wing or even just another big man that's a little more versatile that they can add to this Sixers team to complete it. That is the clear-cut biggest need to me, is while I don't think I'm as tied to positions as some people are, you still need a high-level rebounder, and that was already a weakness of the Sixers team, which they have not improved this offseason. So that for me is the clear-cut biggest need still remaining, but I don't think you can complain when you are adding a talent like Reggie Jackson on a veteran's minimum. So very excited to see what he can bring to the Sixers team. He is a guy that's been a favorite player of mine for quite some time, a guy that I just enjoyed watching from afar on a night-to-night basis. And I did note he does have a 7-foot wingspan, so a little bit of optimism on the defensive side of the floor. But for what it's worth, everything that I've watched, he's been a pretty poor defender overall, so I wouldn't get the hopes up too much there. But ultimately, happy to have him in Philadelphia, so welcome to the Sixers, Reggie Jackson. Appreciate each and every one of you guys for tuning into this video here. Make sure you're smashing that subscribe button if you have not already. Dropping a like on this video and any comments you have below. We got a ton of big plans coming out here on Sixers Digest, getting the tech even more improved. So let me know what you thought of this new setup, but got even more coming with a new intro and stuff like that. So stay tuned for all that in the works. I'll be talking with you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.